Don't nod your heads when you're talking. Just talk naturally to each other.
He wanted to take us places we could never have imagined, and so he imagined them for us. He is Stanley Kubrick.
Hi guys, it's Izzy and I'm back with a very long awaited series here. So I am going to be covering the mysterious life and works of Stanley Kubrick. So I am even more excited than usual to be filming this video today because it was actually suggested by a lovely viewer. Yeah, thank you so much for that suggestion, and yeah, this is really exciting to me because it definitely means that us lot, we rabbit hole down the same sorts of topic. You know, great minds think alike after all. So this video is going to be covering two of my all-time favourite topics. First of all, film. So if you guys didn't know, I actually studied this at university, and of course, because it is me, hashtag conspiracy, I'm gonna have to naturally throw in a few conspiracy theories that I've come across and talking about my thoughts and whether or not I think they're true. Stanley Kubrick is without question one of the most accomplished directors that has ever lived, with him having left a huge legacy on the world of film, with films such as The Shining still being my all-time favourite films to this day. Stanley Kubrick was the definition of there being a fine line between genius and insanity.
Actors are sometimes undisciplined enough not to go home and go to sleep at night and learn their lines, and they go out. They cannot act without knowing dialogue. If you have to think about anything when you're acting, you cannot work on the emotion. And if he's nice, he says, oh boy, Stanley's such a perfectionist. He does 100 takes on every scene. I had to do this thing, 100 times. So the 30 becomes 100. And of course, they never say why you did so many takes. I don't do a lot of takes when it's good.
Look at this. Pulled all my hair. I pulled hunks of hair out on the windowsill. And the back got cut.
Need you trim those.
Hunks of hair.
Oh, look.
Okay.
And he covered so many different topics and different genres of film across his career. It's just impossible to put it into one video. So I have decided to narrow it down to one particular topic to start off with. So this is going to take me back to my film days here. This video essay is going to be unpicking the genius mind of Stanley Kubrick and discuss how he was able to trick the Hollywood and political elites at the time. So I have condensed it into one particular topic, but again, on this topic alone, I had over 100 pages of notes of things to say. I had so much to go into, so don't hate me, I'm really sorry. I am going to have to put this into part one because otherwise I would literally end up doing a Kubrick. I wish, but I would end up literally being here forever and just talking about this subject matter. It would take me weeks and weeks and weeks to film and edit. So I want to get something out to you guys in the meantime. So let's just dive in straight away to part one. Did Stanley Kubrick fake the moon landings?
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Oh, that looks beautiful. Oh, that looks beautiful.
So I had no idea where to start on this subject matter, so I thought I would just dive straight in with a conspiracy theory. Why not? So I've already covered the moon landing conspiracy way back when on my channel, so if you want a more detailed explanation about that and also what I think about the matter, do make sure to check that out. I even conducted some scientific research of my very own in that video, so you know, you guys can't say I don't go all out for my channel. So without going into whether or not the moon landing was fake or not in this video, the conspiracy theory goes that Stanley Kubrick was in fact the director who was hired to fake the moon landing footage back in the 60s. And the reason being is that a lot of people associate one of his earlier pieces of work with the moon landing footage. And this film was called 2001: A Space Odyssey. So as the name suggests, this is a rather trippy film and it's all about a space expedition gone terribly wrong. The plot follows the American spacecraft Discovery 1's mission on Jupiter, and it follows scientists Dr. Bauman and Dr. Frank Poole on board. The Discovery's operations are controlled by a computer called HAL, and this oversees everything on board and communicates to the astronauts via speech. Things start to go horribly wrong on board, and the astronauts sort of ask HAL the computer what's up, and he says it's due to human error. The astronauts, however, don't think that is the case, so they make a plan to disconnect the computer HAL and carry on with their mission manually.
There isn't a single aspect of ship operations that's not under his control. If he were proven to be malfunctioning, I wouldn't see how we'd have any choice but disconnection.
I'm afraid I agree with you.
There'd be nothing else to do.
Be a bit tricky.
Yeah.
We'd have to cut his higher brain functions without disturbing the purely automatic and regulatory systems. And we'd have to work out the transfer procedures of continuing the mission under ground-based computer control.
Yeah. Well, that's far safer than allowing HAL to continue running things.
Unluckily for them, HAL is so advanced he's able to lip read and he's able to understand the plans that these astronauts have to shut him down. In a desperate attempt to keep itself running, it turns against the astronauts. And it's almost as if this piece of technology is a living, conscious being that is afraid of essentially dying.
Do you read me, Hal?
Affirmative, Dave. I read you.
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What's the problem?
I think you know what the problem is just as well as I do.
What are you talking about, Hal?
This mission is too important for me to allow you to jeopardize it.
I don't know what you're talking about, Hal.
I know that you and Frank were planning to disconnect me.
To this day, Hal is recognised as one of Hollywood's most iconic and eeriest villains, which is pretty impressive considering he's just portrayed as a simple dot on the screen. And as I'm filming this video, I am looking into my camera lens and it looks very similar to Hal. I won't lie, it's starting to trip me out. In true Kubrick style, this film's ending is very open to interpretation. Kubrick hates sharing his own input on the endings of his films because part of the fun for him is to leave the viewers to come up with their own interpretation and use their own imagination and come up with their own conclusions. But he has spoke about the ending of 2001: Space Odyssey, so just for entertainment's sake, here's a little snippet about the film's ending from the director himself.
The idea was supposed to be that he is taken in by godlike entities, creatures of pure energy and intelligence with no shape or form, and they put him in what I suppose you could describe as a human zoo, and to study him, and his whole life passes from that point on in that room, and he has no sense of time. It just seems to happen as it does in the film, and they choose this room, which is a very inaccurate replica of French architecture, deliberately so inaccurate, because one was suggesting that they had some idea of something that he might think was pretty, but weren't quite sure, just as we aren't quite sure what to do in zoos with animals.
Now, please forgive me when I say the next bit, but please bear in mind that Stanley Kubrick was a little bit before my time. Quite naively, when I first started studying Kubrick's work, I thought of other films I knew that were shot in the early noughties, like Spider-Man for example, and I saw the title 2001, and I put 2 and 2 together and I got 5. For a hot minute I did think to myself, oh, 2001: Space Odyssey, that must mean that the film was filmed in 2001. But no, I think this is a true testament to Kubrick's work, because this film was decades, not even decades, light years, if you'll pardon the pun, ahead of other films at the time. This film was actually released in 1968, and I don't know about you, I can't get my head around that. How was he able to get the cinematography in 1968 to look like that? Just for context for how ahead of the time Kubrick really was, so another film that was released in 1968, the same exact year, was Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. And I'm not hating on Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, it's still to this day one of my favourite films, but 2001: A Space Odyssey definitely shits all over Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, Shitty Shitty Bang Bang, if you will. No, I'm joking, I do like Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, but in terms of like animation and everything like that, he was just so ahead of the game back then. So why do people say that Kubrick staged the moon landing? So the conspiracy theory goes that America was desperately trying to prove themselves as the #1 advanced nation in the world, and they were trying to beat Russia in the space race.
I therefore ask the Congress, above and beyond the increases I have earlier requested for space activities, to provide the funds which are needed to meet the following national goals. First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
The American government allegedly believed that the Russians might even beat them to the moon. So they thought while they might not possess the right technology to physically go to the moon, they definitely possess the right technology to fake a fake film about the moon landing. Even though 2001 A Space Odyssey was shot in a studio, it was hyper-realistic, using no CGI or computer-generated effects. And this realism generated in the film supposedly caught the eye of the US government. In 1969, the president supposedly thought to himself, who can we trust to pull off such an elaborate stunt? And then everyone's eyes turned to Stanley Kubrick because he had just the year before pulled off such an amazing space film. According to conspiracy theorists, Kubrick's involvement in faking the moon landing was starting to eat him up, but he knew he could never come forward in confessing this because it would ruin him in his career and it would ruin his reputation. So apparently he was left with no other choice but to leave snippets of clues throughout his later work that he was involved in the moon landing. And you know what? This is where things do take a weird turn. So Stanley Kubrick in 1980 adapted Stephen King's novel The Shining. So for those of you that don't know, The Shining is a supernatural thriller, and it's about a man called Jack who turns truly insane after being left with the burden of looking after a ginormous hotel alone with his family, and the isolation essentially drives him insane.
Here's Johnny!
It's said that Stephen King, the author of the original book, was not best pleased with the number of changes that Stanley Kubrick made.
Did you like Kubrick's film of The Shining?
No. Cold. I'm not a cold guy. Stanley Kubrick saw The Haunting as coming from Jack Torrance, from the Jack Nicholson character, whereas I always saw it from outside. So we had a fundamental difference of opinion about it. I always thought that the real difference between my take on it and Stanley Kubrick's take on it was this. In my novel, the hotel burns. In Kubrick's movie, the hotel freezes.
Fans of the film have noticed a giant F you King from Kubrick in his film. So while someone is going to rescue his wife in the hotel, they are driving up a road and they see a car wreck, and in the car wreck there is a red Volvo. So Jack's character in the movie is driving a yellow Volvo, but in the book he's driving a red Volvo. So this is meant to symbolise Kubrick saying, like, I have taken your novel and I've wrecked it and the whole world can see it. So I don't know, that's just a little anecdote there. Nothing to do with the conspiracy theory, but I thought it was interesting nonetheless. So the film The Shining admittedly does have a weird number of Easter eggs referring to space and the moon landing, especially for a film that has absolutely nothing to do with outer space. Conspiracy theories surrounding Kubrick's involvement in the lunar missions were certainly intensified after the 2012 release of Room 237 by Rodney Asher and Tim Kirk, which explored the hidden themes of Kubrick's Shining. Conspiracy theories say there are a number of clues in particular which point to Kubrick's involvement in the moon landing. Something Kubrick did do, for example, was change the room where weird shit happens in the book, which was 217, to Room 237. And it's said that this is a clue because the moon is on average 237,000 miles away from the Earth. The next adaptation that Kubrick made from King's novel was he added in a set of creepy sisters, which are often interpreted to be twins.
Come and play with us, Daddy. Forever and ever.
So for those of you that don't know, the star sign that represents twins is the Gemini star sign. And right before the Apollo missions, NASA had a set of Gemini missions, which are supposedly to have been, faked as well. Another weird coincidence is that the carpet that Danny plays on and that makes up the corridors in this creepy hotel, they are very eerily similar to NASA launch pads. Another weird coincidence is in perhaps one of the most famous scenes in the whole film, which is when Jack starts his mental breakdown and he's typing over and over on the typewriter. All work but no play makes Jack a dull boy. So people have noticed that because of the font, it looks like it's saying A11, so Apollo 11, the rocket ship that supposedly went to the moon, makes Jack a dull boy. So this scene where Shelley Duvall's character finds these letters, it's supposed to represent Stanley Kubrick lying to his wife about what he's really done. So yeah, people say that this isn't actually Jack losing his mind in the film, but it's to represent Kubrick losing his mind and coming to terms with what he's really done. And for me, the strangest part of this whole conspiracy theory and this whole Easter egg thing is the fact that Danny, the little boy in the film, he's literally strutting about the place wearing an Apollo rocket shirt. Again, I was not alive in the 80s, I'm not too sure, you know, from first-hand knowledge about what the fashion was like in the 80s, but for me that just seems so random. Like, out of all the sweatshirts they could have possibly picked in the world, they decided to pick one with the literal rocket ship that went to the moon on it. Anyway, the conspiracy theory is all fun and games, but let's dive into a few reasons why I personally don't believe that Stanley Kubrick faked the moon landing. So the first one is the most obvious one, and there's no actual proof that Stanley Kubrick was involved in any way in faking the moon landing or having anything to do with NASA or the US government. This for me seems to be a little bit of a case of, you know, Occam's razor, the simplest solution is the most logical solution, but as we know that is not always the case. Like, there's no correlation between Stanley Kubrick and the moon landings other than his film 2001 Space Odyssey. To me it seems like people literally went, oh, who could have faked the moon landing? Oh yeah, it must have been Stanley Kubrick, he just made a film about space. Like, there doesn't seem to be any more evidence or any more correlation between the two than that. And you guys know I love to play along with a good old conspiracy theory, but let's dive into some of the explanations, shall we, behind the Easter eggs in The Shining. Because there does seem to be some rational explanations if you do believe them. First off, room 217. As exciting as it would be that Stanley Kubrick, you know, changed the name, this was actually not Stanley Kubrick's decision. It was actually the hotel's decision. So The Shining was filmed mostly on studio, but for the exterior they did film at the Timberland Lodge in Northern Oregon. So the hotel, they didn't want people seeing this film and then being put off from staying in this room. They didn't want to lose any business from it, so they had to pick one which was not already a real room in the hotel. Regarding Danny's choice of sweater, again there is somewhat a logical explanation to this. So in an interview with New York Times, Leon Vitali, so remember that name for the next video, this name will pop up again. He was Kubrick's longtime PA and he explained that Stanley wanted something for the film to look handmade and authentic. For me, again, I'm not too sure how much I believe the extent for this one because Stanley Kubrick was such a perfectionist with all of his work. There's no way to me like he hadn't have heard of these like Apollo rumours that were floating about of his involvement. I think this was him playing up to it a little bit, if anything. Like, imagine this, you're a director and you're an absolute perfectionist about absolutely everything you do, and then your costume designer comes up with a costume that would literally reinforce one of the biggest conspiracies about your career, and you wouldn't clock it. Like, for me, I think this is just a gag on Kubrick's behalf. Like, I think the whole of it, all of the Easter eggs in the film, are just a gag on Kubrick's behalf. I think he was having a good sense of humour about the thing and was just playing into these conspiracy theories just for a little bit of excitement for the viewer. Anyway, that is my personal theory. And also, last but not least, if you compare the actual moon landing footage to the film 2001 Space Odyssey, they look completely different. Okay, they're both space films, but for example, the astronauts in 2001, they walk about the surface with no buoyancy whatsoever, and then in the moon landing footage, they're bouncing about all over the shop. And I think, to be honest, if Stanley Kubrick did direct a fake moon landing footage, it would have been a lot better than the footage that we've got. Like, it would have looked so much more cinematic, I'm sure of it. So all in all, I don't 100% believe this conspiracy theory that he was involved, just because I don't think there's a lot of evidence for it. And to be honest, I dug really deep behind the motives about why Kubrick would have made the film 2001 Space Odyssey in the first place, and I think I've come up with a motive, well, discovered a motive, and to be honest, this is far more interesting, in my opinion, than any conspiracy theory that's out there. Stanley Kubrick made 2001 A Space Odyssey in order to trick Hollywood and political elites at the time. Going back to the original theme of this video, Stanley Kubrick was truly a genius in his work, and he was able to get his message across to the mass audience on the big screen, and he knew exactly how to get around those who might try and stop him getting his message across. It's evident from a lot of his works that he doesn't always agree with the day-to-day running of things and actually goes against the establishment in many ways. One of his most controversial yet successful films was his 1964 hit Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. The film was a true black comedy covering topics such as nuclear war. And one of my favourite things about the film is that one of the main characters is called Jack the Ripper, which is obviously a play on words on Jack the Ripper, one of London's most notorious serial killers. I just think that's a clever pun. Good going, Kubrick. The film is still considered one of America's greatest comedies of all times.
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
But considering that it was released just 2 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, it definitely struck a nerve with a lot of people. So naturally, not everyone saw it in a funny light. In fact, Columbia Pictures, the studio behind the film, they were not overly enthusiastic about the film. The studio heads at the time were Abe Schneider and Mo Rotem, and they distanced themselves from the film, calling it a novelty flick which did not reflect the views of the corporation in any way. Given the film's themes, people branded it as an anti-military film and even an anti-American film, with people going as far as to call Stanley Kubrick a communist. Kubrick, of course, had not planned the end of his career and the end of his reputation so suddenly, so he had to think of a way to regain the trust of production companies to let him continue doing his artistic work. In the early 60s, there was a huge buzz in America regarding the space race, with JFK pushing this as much as possible. That's when Kubrick had the revolution that his next film must be a space film. He knew the space race was coming up and that the president and production companies would be all over a pro-American, pro-space film. So that's when he reached out to a man called Arthur C. Clarke, who was a really famous science fiction writer at the time, and he wanted him to help him in the writing of this movie. Arthur C. Clarke was truly able to look at our world and predict the way in which technology would affect us. He was famous for predicting inventions ahead of their time, such as the satellite, GPS, and the modern smartphone. I read an article which was really fascinating. It was talking about the partnership between Arthur C. Clarke and Kubrick, and this article was posted on the book forum, and it's called You Say You Want an Evolution by A.S. Hamara. So in this article, I found out something really cool which blew my mind. It literally blew my mind. So as the pair of them, they were shaking hands, making the deal of this partnership in Kubrick's Upper East Side apartment. They were looking over the skyline of Manhattan, and they looked up into the sky and they saw perhaps the biggest omen of all. They literally saw a UFO. What's even weirder is that this object was not listed in the New York Times visible satellites table for that day, and they had checked. So is that not the greatest omen of all? So they carried on working on this film in true Kubrick style for over 3.5 years. They spent over $12 million on this film, with Kubrick's budget being however much it cost to make. And the release date for this film was whenever it was done. So Kubrick was a true perfectionist when it came to his work. He absolutely would not release something unless he felt 100% comfortable with it. And he was known to always have final cut on his films and to always make changes, even on the way to movie premieres sometimes, and even after the release. So there is a huge controversy between how Kubrick pitched this film and the final cut. I watched a really interesting video by Collective Learning who explained this topic in such detail, but essentially in this partnership, Kubrick was in charge of making the movie and Arthur C. Clarke was in charge of pitching it.
And Kubrick's like, okay, so they want a pro-space race propaganda movie that's going to sell the moon landings, and it's going to sell space research, and it's going to sell technology. So he started developing it from there, and he was approaching different famous sci-fi writers, and he ended up with Arthur C. Clarke. And as far as I can tell, what he was basically doing there was he needed somebody to be a front, a convincing front who could go to industry and sell them this bullshit movie, this ultimate pro-space race, evolution of man to becoming God, and, you know, transhumanist in a lot of ways, 2001. He needed to sell that bullshit story. And rather than do it himself, I don't think he would have had the heart to go and stand up in these rooms with these corporate bosses and say all this stuff. Gets Arthur C. Clarke to go and do it. And Clarke actually believed in all those messages anyway, so that made it convincing. And then all these corporate bosses and people at NASA and places like that, they all loved Arthur C. Clarke anyway, because he was very much into the idea of man turning into machine and traveling to the stars.
So yeah, Kubrick was making his little film and Clark was going off to the investors, one of which was rumoured to be IBM, one of the world's first and biggest technology companies of all times, who were heavily helping them with the film and investing in the film.
The Sage computer, made by IBM, is another example of the vast new powers that man can achieve through the creative use of his mind. Strength for national defense, speed for informed decisions, service for a growing America. This is IBM, freeing man's mind to shape the future.
The company IBM was given fictional credit for the machinery in the film, and fans jumped onto the theory that HAL was actually a secret shout out to IBM because all of the letters in HAL are actually one letter before each of the letters in IBM. Clark claims in his book The Lost Worlds of 2001 that HAL actually stood for Heuristic Programmed Algorithm Computer. Duh. And he explained that IBM had actually given them a lot of help for the movie, so he was actually quite embarrassed about the coincidence when it was highlighted to him. But I have a sneaky suspicion that Clark and Kubrick have had to backtrack on IBM's involvement after all. So at the start of the movie, like I said, Kubrick had pitched this pro-space race film to them, so when they showed the initial movie premiere to all the investors, there was 10 minutes of footage at the start of the film which talked about scientists and how plausible travel to interstellar space would really be.
In this London suburb, space scientists, industrial designers, and conceptual artists from all over the world are gathering at the MGM studios. They have been brought together to contribute their knowledge, their ideas, their visions, to advise and consult in the filming of Stanley Kubrick's 2001. A full-size model of the Lunar Excursion Module is the setting for a visit and conversation between Arthur Clarke and Tom Buck of Look magazine.
Arthur, here we are on the LEM ship, and one can almost imagine we're on our way to the moon, or we've arrived at the moon, as a matter of fact.
Yes, it's hard to realize that in a few years, some American astronaut will be looking through this window out onto the lunar surface. And what we are doing in the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey, is showing some of the things that will develop in the world of the future.
Then, before the movie's official release, he completely cut out this part from this film, and the film was left with a very different message after all, where essentially machinery turns against man, and yeah, it doesn't really leave you with the most pro-AI message after all. So it's said in the Stanley Kubrick archives that there are letters from IBM, and they were understandably pissed because they had thrown a lot of money into this film, and then all of a sudden it's just a backhand to them. You know, they didn't want to be putting money into a film which literally says computers can turn against mankind. Like, that is such bad press for them and such bad publicity. They apparently asked them to completely remove all their logos from the film, but fans have spotted that their logo does still appear in some scenes of the film. But all in all, Kubrick had done it successfully. He had got the funding from his giant investors to allow him to make a film exactly the way he wanted yet again. He was going to let no one get in the way of his creative freedom. There you are, that is part one of Kubrick's genius movie magic. If you like this video, do make sure to stick around because I've got a very exciting Kubrick video coming next. We're going to be taking a deep dive in particular into the movie Eyes Wide Shut, which is all about exposing Hollywood's cults and sex rings. And not just that, we're going to be diving deep into some very mysterious circumstances surrounding Kubrick's death. Did he push things too far over his career? Did he finally take things too far and piss off the wrong people when he was exposing these cults? All that is still yet to come. In the meantime, if you did like this video and you haven't checked out my moon landing video already, do make sure to do that because, yeah, like I said, it's a very similar topic. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, guys. If you did like the video, do make sure to leave a cheeky little thumbs up. It means a lot to me. And as always, if you guys do have any video suggestions, please let me know in the comments because you guys know I love to rabbit hole down the weird depths of the internet. So yeah, thank you so much for watching and I will catch you guys soon. Bye!